I'm going to talk about, I really want to talk a lot about Martin Luther King Jr. because tomorrow's Martin Luther King Jr.'s not only birthday, but day, right? This is the day we celebrate his life, and his life should be celebrated. Are you recording now, John? Yeah. Okay, so here's Martin Luther King Jr., and we usually see him like this, right? This is probably the most famous photograph at Washington Monument. There's hundreds of thousands of men and women here, frankly, of all religions, by the way. He didn't just work with African-American people. And here he is speaking. This is the apex of his success in life, but it wasn't always like that. And by the way, True Father said, when they asked him, who do you think is the most influential American in the last 100 years, he said it was Martin Luther King Jr. So it seems to me that if Reverend Moon said he's the most influential American, we should study his words and we should understand how he got to the point where he was. Does that make sense? Yeah, yeah. So I have a book about him. Let me see if I can find it. It's got to be right here somewhere. Anyway, oh, here it is. It's called Strength to Love. It's a book of his sermons that I encourage everybody to read. It's a book of sermons and how he gets to the ideas that he has. So anyway, let me continue. He's a remarkable person, and to me, I've always wondered, how did he do it? How could he do it? It's amazing to me, right? He never hurt anybody, never killed anybody, never burned anything down, never attacked anybody, nevertheless changed the nation in which we live. And at the end, I'll give you an anecdote of just how much that change has been, right? Okay, first off, when he was born into a nation of Jim Crow laws. You know what Jim Crow means? It's just a slang, bad term for African American people. Jim Crow was a decisive slang term for a black man. It came to mean any state law passed in the South that established different rules for blacks and whites. Jim Crow laws were based on the theory of white supremacy and were a reaction to Reconstruction. In the Depression-racked 1890s, racism appealed to whites who feared losing their jobs to blacks. I think that's 100% not true. This is like a Marxist idea. The reason white people were fighting with black people was about something about economics. It's 100% not true. It's purely from a Cain-type feeling of desire to kill your brother. It's purely Cain-type. It's internal, and it's from Satan himself, right? So politicians abused blacks to win the votes of poor white people. Newspapers fed the bias of white leaders by playing up black crimes, right? And even sometimes making them up. But here's the reality. The reality is it's from a Cain-like idea. That is, life on earth is hard for everybody. It's hard for, crackers in the South. Just kidding, white people. It's hard for white people in the South. It's hard for black people in the South. It's hard for Hispanic people. It's hard for Indians. It's hard for everybody. The question is, what idea do you get from that? And many isms, whether it's Nazism, Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, all those isms think life is hard. In order for a life to be better for me, I must put somebody else down for me to raise up. Right? We see that's a satanic, demonic thought. What do we believe? We believe we need to raise everybody up. We need to raise ourselves and allow other people to be raised up to overcome the struggle and suffering, right? A 180 degrees different idea. So when Cain saw Abel was blessed by God, instead of thinking, I need to raise myself up to be blessed by God, he thought, I need to put Abel down. I need to murder or kill him. And that's what's been going on throughout human life always. Through human life always. And that is this idea, I had to put him down to raise myself up. 2 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court seemed to seal the fate of black Americans when it upheld a Mississippi law designed to deny black men the vote, right? Given the green light, southern states began to limit the voting right to those who owned property or could read well, to those whose grandfathers had been able to vote, to those with good characters, to those who paid poll taxes. In 1896, Louisiana had 130,334 registered black voters. Remember, this is after Reconstruction. Lincoln wanted to resolve all the issues. He was not into crushing anybody down. He was into raising everybody up. So But then, by 8 years later, only 1,342 people, 1%, could pass the state's new rules. That's what the Voting Rights Act of '63 is all about, by the way, and things like that. Jim Crow laws touched every part of life. In South Carolina, black and white textile workers could not work in the same room, enter through the same door, or gaze out the same window. Many industries wouldn't hire blacks. Many unions passed rules to exclude them. And it was worse than that, by the way. Under Jim Crow law, in order for you to quit your job and go to work somewhere else, you had to have permission from your employer. So it's essentially another type of slavery. And by the way, and this is really important that you understand, when they make laws like that, it crushes the economy. They think they're only hurting black people, but they're wrecking lives for themselves too. That's why the South has always been poor, impoverished, miserable because of racism. By 1914, Texas had 6 entire towns in which blacks could not live. Mobile, Alabama passed a Jim Crow curfew. Blacks could not leave their homes after 10 p.m. Signs marked whites only or colored hung over doors, ticket windows, and drinking fountains. You know, I went there in 1964. My mother wanted to somehow move there. It was terrible, horrible. Georgia had black and white parks. Oklahoma had black and white phone booths. Prisons, hospitals, and orphanages were segregated as were schools and colleges. In North Carolina, black and white students had to use separate sets of textbooks. In Florida, the books couldn't even be stored together. Atlanta courts kept 2 Bibles, one for black witnesses and one for whites. Virginia told fraternal social groups that black and white members could not address each other as brother. Right, so this is very complete, very dominant problem for African Americans in the South. And some up in the North as well. Not as much, but humiliation. Now this is a very important part. Humiliation was about the best treatment blacks who broke such rules could hope for. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, which revived in 1915, used venom and violence to keep blacks in the place, to keep blacks down, right? To keep people down, which made everybody be down, by the way. Okay, so if you think about it, at this time, all the political leaders in the South were white, Democrat, demagogues. Police chiefs were all like Bull Connors, a police chief of Birmingham, Alabama, was anti-segregationist. He was a segregationist, anti-interracial congregation. So what could African American people do? It was a big, giant problem. Nevertheless, this is when Martin Luther King Jr. decided that he would lead a group of people. And here's the difference to me and in almost every other group that exists today. Martin Luther King Jr. did this in the name of God. As a Christian, with the understanding that his goal was to forgive white people, and that the dream was that white people, black people, Indian people, Chinese, everybody would work together harmoniously in the name of God. That's our belief, right? One family under God. That's us. That's why I like Martin Luther King Jr., and that's why he was successful when nobody else was successful. And that's why we have Martin Luther King Jr. Day. He said, these are his words, and that's all this whole thing is about. We aren't engaged in any negative protests and in any negative arguments with anybody. He wasn't here to put white people down. He wasn't here to exact revenge against white people. So therefore, people could join him. Anybody could listen to him. Anyone could be a part of him, right? He said this, we are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people, human beings. We are saying that we are God's children. See, this is the difference between almost everybody and Martin Luther King Jr. He just wanted to be God's children, and that we as God's children don't have to live like we are forced to live. And of course, did they bomb his house? Yes. Did they bomb his church? Yes. Did they threaten to kill him? And finally, he was assassinated. He was murdered, right? On the other hand, and we say his name is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because he was a Baptist minister. He wasn't just a black civil rights organizer. He wanted civil rights for all human beings and a better economy for everybody. And that's why I respect him and deeply revere and love him. And if you read his words, that's what he's about. He's about poor white people as well as poor black people.
Here's another one. Here's these words. In our own nation, under another unjust and evil system known as slavery, for nearly 100 years inflicted black people with a sense of inferiority, deprived them of their personhood, and denied them their God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Slavery was a shame of America, but as on the world scale, so in our nation, the wind of change began to blow. One event followed another to bring an end to slavery and the system of segregation that was created in its aftermath. Right?
So, if you read this and you understood the divine principle, we say, why did everything change? Why did slavery end? We say it's because of the preparation for the second coming of Christ. And it's the building of God's kingdom. Century after century, year after year, decade after decade, nation after nation, God's side is winning.
God sent us by here to say to you that you're not treating his children right. And we've come up by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment where God's children are concerned. See, he was never for black people. And I don't mean he wasn't for black people, but he considered African American people God's children. And that's a completely different mindset, a whole different ideology. He didn't say you have to treat black people right, you have to treat God's children right. And I think that's a source, that's the deepest source of his tremendous power to win people's hearts. Now, if you are not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that we must follow. And our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you. So two things. One, he had this deep inner ideological understanding of God's will. And he always compared he didn't compare himself to Moses, but he considered his battle the same as Moses' battle to save the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt. And you know what? It was terrible. Bill Connors was an evil man. They were evil. They were horrible people. Nevertheless, they survived. And they survived without hitting anybody back, which is sort of like unbelievable to think of the courage it takes to not fight back. And here's him when he was in jail in Birmingham, Alabama. Here's his family. And here's what he said. And we just went on before the dogs, and we would look at them, and we'd go on before the water hoses, and we would look at it, and we'd just go on singing. Over my head, I see freedom in the air. And then we would be thrown into the paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stuck in there like sardines in a can. And they would throw us in, and old Bull, meaning Bull Connor, would say, take them off. And they did. We would just go in the paddy wagon singing, we shall overcome. And every now and then we'd get in jail, and we'd see the jailers looking through the windows being moved by our prayers. See the difference? See that power? And being moved by our words and our songs. This is like early Christianity in front of the Romans. Singing, praying to God. It changed many Romans from being pagans to being Christians. And there was a power there which Bill Connor couldn't adjust to. And so we ended up transforming Bull into a steer. And we won our struggle in Birmingham. Now we've got to go on in Memphis just like that. I call upon you to be with us when we go out Monday. You know what the difference between a steer and a bull is? Keep it to yourself. Anyhow, that's what he meant. So then he went on to tremendous success, and it wasn't him by himself, right? He says, these great changes. So he won the Nobel Prize. Laws began to change all over. There's other pictures. I think I have him meeting with various presidents. Eisenhower, you remember Eisenhower? Sent in the 101st Airborne to protect I think they were called the Birmingham Nine, the 9 first black kids to go to a previously segregated white school. What happened was the governor, who was a Democrat governor, not to be political, called out the state National Guard to keep those 9 black kids from going to school. President Eisenhower sent the 101st Air Force and took over the National Guard, made them national soldiers, and protected. 101st Airborne is a significant power in the community, and they escorted the 9 kids to school for a long time, by the way. It wasn't one night or 2 nights, and they were the first kids to go to school. So he won tremendous political power, and people could see the honesty of his message and the depth of it. He says these great changes are not mere political and sociological shifts. It isn't about the economy.
That's what he's saying. It's not about the economy, or he says they represent the passing of systems that were born in injustice, nurtured inequality, and reared in exploitation. They represent the inevitable decay of any system based upon principles that are not in harmony with the moral laws of the universe. So what he's saying is, it's God's will that Jim Crow laws change. It isn't about the economy or industry or a job. It's about God's will and what's not God's will. That's why I think he had so much power.
When in future generations people look back upon these turbulent, tension-packed days, they will see God working through history for our salvation. They will see that God is able to conquer the evils of history. I love him for that. And if
people want to change the world, this is the pattern. He's the pattern. I think many so-called civil rights groups have lost this pattern and have gone over to the Marxist idea we have to put them down in order for us to rise up. And it's just a mistake.
He says, God's control is never usurped. If at times we despair because of the relatively slow progress being made in ending racial discrimination, let us gain new heart in the fact that God is able. In our sometimes difficult and often lonesome walk up freedom's road, we do not walk alone. God walks with us. God has placed within the very structure of the universe certain absolute moral laws. And that's what he was calling, that's what he's preaching about. That's what his word of God is. We can neither defy nor break them. If we disobey them, they will break us. The forces of evil may temporarily conquer truth, but truth will ultimately conquer its conqueror. Our God is able. And if you want to find these words, oh, sorry,
by the way, the Hebrew community really joined with them. Many white groups and white churches joined with Martin Luther King Jr. So it wasn't just about him and his groups. I read many of his sermons. I admire Reverend King with little money, little political support, using for the most part, only the Word of God to inspire and convict people. He didn't hit people, right? He used the Word of God to convict Bull Connors and all those racists and make it clear to the world that they were wrong and they were evil and they had to change. He changed the nation. I'll give you this brief anecdote. You know, I have a little brother named Eric, probably you never met. He's a sergeant in the Birmingham Police Department, right? So that's like the heart of racism, right? His mother is a Mexican Indian. My mother was the same mother, and he married an African American lady. So his job is to train other policemen. He married an African American lady, and my nephews as half African American, half me, half African American. And I only make this clear because in Bull Connor's day, that would be impossible. That would be impossible to accomplish that. Right? A sergeant in the Birmingham Police Department has an interracial marriage with an African American lady. Pretty amazing, right? Pretty amazing. So I think clearly there are significant changes made by Martin Luther King Jr. that are measurable. This is a true mother. And I just wanted to remind you this. When he was asked who is the greatest American leader of the 20th century, Reverend Moon replied, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. At a time when many oppressed people wanted to return hate for hate, Dr. King said we must return love for hate. Dr. King was imprisoned over and over again, and he gave his life for what he believed, but his words continue to inspire us. Amen? Amen. Amen. Why don't we have a round of applause before we finish for Martin Luther King Jr.